The Republican National Convention in Milwaukee is wrapping up, and critics of former President Trump lined up to pledge their full support. It's a sharp turn from the likes of Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis, who attacked the former president on the campaign trail earlier this year. The former presidential hopefuls took to the stage and made it clear that Republicans are standing united, confident Trump will win the Oval Office this November.
Donald Trump has my strong endorsement, period.
My fellow Republicans, let's send Joe Biden back to his basement and let's send Donald Trump back to the White House.
Kicking off the week by announcing Ohio Senator JD Vance as his vice presidential pick.
I am proud to announce that Senator JD Vance has the overwhelming support of this convention to be the next vice president of the United States.
Trump arrived on day one to massive cheers from the crowd.
We are here tonight with one purpose, and that is to elect Donald J. Trump as the next president of the United States.
Bringing a united energy to the convention just days after an attempted assassination on his life in Pennsylvania. Republicans are banding together, confident that a red wave will sweep the U.S. election cycle. And it comes with good reason. The latest polling continues to show former President Trump is leading nationwide. It's time to go on the record with Scott Tranter, Director of Data Science from Decision Desk HQ. Scott, thank you for joining us during this very busy news week. We're going to kick it off with the Veep stakes. Former President Trump has officially picked Ohio Senator JD Vance to be his running mate. We know that Vance has been a rising star in the Republican Party since he was elected to the Senate in 2022, but he's only 39 years old and relatively inexperienced. Scott, were you surprised by this pick, and do you think his young age was a factor in that this could signal Trump passing the torch to a new face of the MAGA movement?
Yeah, it was not surprising. I mean, he's been a top choice, or at least top talked about the last few months. Ohio is not a state that Donald Trump is in danger of losing. As you pointed out, he's pretty young. The voters don't know a lot about him. If you look at Republicans have a decent idea who he is, but when you look at favorability ratings for JD Vance, over 40% of voters don't have an opinion of him yet. So that's a blank slate. That's an opportunity for the Trump campaign to put a fresh face out there and give voters someone to look at. Someone new that they don't have an opinion of, and see if they like his policies and what he's about to say. I do know the Trump campaign says they're going to place him in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan. Those are key states. I'm sure we'll talk about that soon. But he is supposed to be able to appeal to those rural voters, and we'll see if it's going to happen.
Yeah, interestingly enough, last week, the Biden campaign said that the president's path to victory runs through Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So definitely must-win seats for both sides of the aisle this election. So, Scott, I know it's been only less than 24 hours since JD Vance was chosen to be Trump's running mate. But do you have any indication of what forecasting shows for Republicans' chances now that Vance is on the ticket?
You know what? The forecast hasn't moved in anything direct from JD Vance. But what I would say is this: it's probably an unknown right now, simply because over 40% of Americans don't have an opinion on him. So it could be bad, could be good for the forecast for Donald Trump. But they're going to have hundreds of millions of dollars, and he's going to have a lot of airtime over the next few months to get his first impression. And I'm certain he will have an impact, just because of how vocal he is, and how in a contrast in age and some of his positions are going to sound as they come out over the next couple months.
Absolutely. And Democrats already on the defense, with the DNC launching their first paid media campaign against the Trump-Vance ticket. So it's already off to the races on that front. So I want to turn our attention to a new YouGov survey for the Times that shows Trump is leading in all 7 swing states. Is this in line with Decision Desk's forecasting?
Yeah, so it's interesting that those polls are very good for Trump at the state level. We're looking at the polling aggregation, the Hill polling averages. And especially that one in Pennsylvania. I mean, that's just another great poll for Donald Trump in a state that he absolutely has to win. What's interesting happening at the national level is generic ballot, just general opinion of Republicans and Democrats, which is a major input for the model, has gotten a little better for Joe Biden over the last week or so. And that's generic ballot. That doesn't mean that people specifically like Joe Biden or specifically like a certain person. It's just the voters' feelings of the Democratic Party or Republican Party. That has gotten a little better over the last week or so, and that has counteracted some of these state polls. So that's kind of what we're seeing at the forecast level. Still Donald Trump favored, but we're seeing a little bit of a branding for the Democrats at the national level. But at the state level, where it matters in the presidency, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, those polls from the New York Times, not good.
Yeah. I want to move back to JD Vance. We remember when he rose to fame in 2016 after releasing his book, Hillbilly Elegy, that essentially detailed his experiences growing up in Ohio and Kentucky in a working class community. But I am old enough to remember that in that book, he was very critical of Trump and his popularity among the working class white vote. And we also remember when JD Vance would go on cable news and, frequently bash Donald Trump in the early stages of his 2016 campaign. He's compared him to Hitler. He's called him an idiot. It's been quite the political evolution for Senator Vance. How did he manage to get back into the good graces of the MAGA movement? I mean, as someone who's followed him for a few years now, it seems to have begun when he thought about running for Senate in Ohio.
Yeah, no, look, JD Vance, someone I've been watching too for a little while. I actually met him back when he was a venture capitalist here in the Washington, D.C. area. He is very good, just like Donald Trump, at reading the room. And he is very good. He's always wanted to be a politician. And so I think those two skills have kind of helped him figure out, okay, well, I want to be a Republican senator. I want to be a Republican nominee. Donald Trump is clearly taking over the party. And it all started with that endorsement he got in that Senate campaign that you mentioned. And ever since then, he talks about it pretty directly. He has a change of heart. He doesn't necessarily believe or think those things that he has said before. And he takes it head on. And it appears that Donald Trump takes him at his word. He's been able to take that message and really take the mantle of the MAGA movement. And at the end of the day, it'll be interesting to see where he takes it. Because as you point out, he's 39 years old. He is the presumptive GOP nominee frontrunner going into 2028 as of today as well.
So, yeah, we remember, Republicans are very much essentially saying that Vice President Harris and President Biden also went head to head in the 2020 primary. So they say bygones can be bygones and water under the bridge in politics. So speaking of President Biden, earlier this week during an interview with NBC's Lester Holt, President Biden was asked if he believed the assassination attempt on Trump has changed the trajectory of the race. His response was, quote, "I don't know, and you don't know either." Scott, is there any update on Decision Desk's forecasting of the presidential election since Saturday's shooting? Republicans I've been chatting with seem to think that this will be a big boon to Trump.
Yeah, no, I happen to agree. We've had exactly one poll post assassination attempt, so that's not necessarily enough data. But polls and forecasts are not good for these rapid movement events and things like that. And I imagine we're going to get some data in the next week or so as more and more organizations poll something like this. But at the end of the day, look, an event like that, an event that all of us are going to remember where we were 10, 15, 20 years from now, that is going to have a mark on Republican voters and, and even non-Republican voters. And it's going to be a rallying cry, certainly for the Republican base. And we're going to see that in the enthusiasm gap, I think, as we come out. So that's a long way of me saying is we haven't seen it in the forecast yet, but it wasn't trending good for Joe Biden post-debate. And this event is probably going to be a rallying cry and another good data point for Donald Trump as he, gears up post-convention.
So speaking of, the post-shooting impact on the election, we've all seen what has already been called an iconic photo by Republicans of President Trump with his fist in the air. His face is bloodied. That's from the shooting at his rally in Pennsylvania. What do you see this image doing for Republicans going forward? I mean, I imagine that this is going to be a major flashpoint in the campaign.
Yeah, campaign images are iconic. I'm sure we all remember. Most of us remember 2008, the Barack Obama, motif on a T-shirt, the Obey shirt. Barack Obama was an icon, and a brand coming out of 2008, and I kind of see that out of Donald Trump this cycle, especially after some of those photos and just him. We've all seen him walk in and out of a UFC fight and those types of adoration and people rallying around him, things like that. These photos are going to be something we're going to be looking at for 20 or 30 years, and the campaign was already using them in fundraising, and branding and merchandise. So it's certainly resonating, and it will be something we're going to look at and the campaign's going to use for the next few months.
Several Republicans and Democrats have called for the political rhetoric to be cooled down in the days after this shooting. President Biden has called for it. President Trump has called for unity. Do you think we're going to see that moving forward, or is this going to be something that we hear maybe for the next couple of weeks and, it sort of leaves our collective memory?
Yeah, I think this is something we're going to hear for a week or two, and then we're going to go back to where we were before. America's still pretty polarized. That's why we see, 30-40% of Democrats always sticking with their side, 30-40% of Republicans always sticking with theirs, and the rest of the middle, we pretty much know where they're going to end up. They're going to go where they went before. Polarization's here. It's on pause right now, but I think we're going to see the rhetoric come back to what it was before here in the next couple of weeks, because neither side wants to lose, and both sides are looking at this as an existential election for their respective parties.
Scott, the shooting happened on the heels of what was a really disastrous 2-week news cycle for President Biden, his campaign, his administration. And we were hearing these continuous calls from House Democrats and donors for Biden to drop out of the race. It seems that at least publicly, those calls have gone a bit quiet, but we understand that behind closed doors, that conversation is still very much happening. So what does Biden need to do now to move forward and stay in the race, particularly ahead of the Democratic National Convention next month?
Well, I was reading this morning they're going to try and do some virtual voting to solidify the nominee here at the end of the month, which they actually don't need to do. That was actually a potential response to the state of Ohio saying they're going to leave Joe Biden off the ballot unless he's the nominee. That law was changed, so they don't necessarily need to vote before the convention, but that is certainly something the Biden campaign's doing. They're trying to get that nomination so they don't have to wait another month for it and that chatter to continue. I've been hearing the same things you are. Nancy Pelosi certainly isn't a supporter behind the scenes. The calls that were happening Saturday before the assassination weren't necessarily good for Joe Biden. Everyone's on pause right now, but I think post RNC convention, I think you're going to see some of those calls and that chatter pick up again.
Scott Tranter, as always, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
It was a terrifying and deadly moment during a Trump rally in Pennsylvania. A bullet grazing former President Trump's ear. One person dead and another seriously injured after an assassination attempt that sent shockwaves around the world. It's time to wake up, Washington. After an already turbulent year of political threats and accusations and a country seriously divided, both President Biden and former President Trump have called for Americans to tone down the political rhetoric and unite this country. Unite America, Trump posted on Truth Social following the attempted assassination, while Biden called for unity in his Oval Office address.
The political record in this country has gotten very heated. It's time to cool it down.
But is it really possible to unite a country so deeply divided? Joining us now to discuss this is Professor of Political Science at the University of Washington, James Long. James, thanks so much for joining me here today. Historically, do events like this, meaning the attempted assassination on former President Trump, unify the country or just serve to further divide us?
I think in this case, it will serve to further divide us. The last president who was shot was Ronald Reagan in 1981, and his polling numbers did go up after that. They went up by probably double digits. But he had just been elected. He had the goodwill of the country already. Thankfully, he survived his injuries. And so by 1984, when voters were thinking about whether or not to reelect Reagan, other things mattered more, I think. And the fact that he had been shot, I don't think really played into it. I think with Trump, most voters and most Americans have their minds made up. And so I don't think they're necessarily changing how they think about Trump or Biden, or other aspects of the election. I think probably it's just the case that Americans are now having to really confront a very recent occurrence of political violence and what that means for our democratic system.
Right, and all coming just a day before the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. So definitely references to the attempted assassination at the floor at the convention in Wisconsin. So James, prior to the attempted assassination, the U.S. was already very deeply divided. When was the last time we've seen the U.S. this polarized politically? Most people I talk to say the Civil War or pre-Civil War.
I don't know if I would go that far back. I think the comparison that a lot of social scientists are making is with the 1960s, which is before I was alive, but I have studied history and politics in that era. And I think in 1968 in particular, which of course has resonance of political assassinations, unfortunately, with RFK Jr. and MLK, as well as the Democratic Convention in the city of Chicago. And questions about a sitting president and whether he should run for re-election, although by the time of the convention, LBJ had decided not to run for re-election. But just divisions in this country over civil rights, over the Vietnam War, over women's rights and gay rights, really dividing the country, not just politically, but also culturally. And this sort of sense that things were really changing, and they did really change. And through the 70s as well, I think the country was very divided. Then by the 1980s, I think things unified a little bit more. Ronald Reagan came into office, was very popular, was obviously reelected in 1984. And so I think the 1960s is probably a better comparison than saying the Civil War before the Civil War.
Yeah, definitely a bit more, even though the 1960s were very tumultuous, definitely a bit more optimistic than saying the Civil War. And obviously a lot of comparisons, particularly to, the Democratic Party, the Democratic National Convention is obviously coming up. And I see a lot of parallels between this upcoming election, or convention, and the DNC in 1968. So both Biden and Trump have called for unity in the wake of this assassination. James, do you see that actually happening? And if not, what else will it even take at this point?
Well, my instinct is to say no, but I would temper that by saying that Donald Trump will have an opportunity tomorrow when he accepts the nomination at the RNC to sort of give us really his first public statement, but sort of what his ideas around unity might be. We've already heard from President Biden. We heard from him on Saturday night after the event occurred. We heard his Oval Office address on Sunday. He has subsequently made other statements in the interview with Lester Holt. So I think we've heard from Biden's side how he's thinking about this. So I think we should reserve judgment until tomorrow and give Trump the opportunity to make a public statement in how he intends to unify the country. But I'm deeply skeptical. I think voters that hate Donald Trump hate him as much this week as they did last week. I think voters that love Donald Trump, they may love him a little bit more, but I don't think the core MAGA base has changed at all. And I don't think the Democrats that are opposed to Donald Trump have changed at all. That's not to say that any side is necessarily in favor of political violence, but I think it means that we still remain deeply divided and deeply polarizing. What would cause us to overcome that difference, I think, is the type of leader who can bring Americans together. Donald Trump is not that leader. If we look historically at the way he's behaved, he's often doubled down. He has called for violence or joked about violence against his real or perceived political enemies. He has encouraged violence at his rallies. He incited a violent insurrection to overthrow a free and fair election. So I'm deeply skeptical that Donald Trump could be that person. I think Joe Biden in his person wants to be that person, but I think the fears with Joe Biden is whether or not he's too old, whether or not he may be right in his sentiment, but he may not be the right sort of body and face in place to make that case strongly for the Democrats. But so right now I'm deeply skeptical, unfortunately.
We know that former President Trump has said he tore up his original RNC convention speech in favor of something that he says is more unifying post-assassination attempts. So we'll have to see how that plays out. So, James, we've seen the blame game, unfortunately, really rearing its ugly head. How dangerous is it in this political climate to throw blame around when it comes to a violent incident like this?
Yeah, that's a very good question to a social scientist, because I'm going to answer it like a social scientist, which is to say that, first and foremost, we need to blame the perpetrator. And the alleged gunman, has obviously been killed by Secret Service, but that person is directly responsible for what happened. And it is nearly impossible to try to draw any causal link between what he did, and we still don't know his motives. We still don't know a lot about the case, and so I hesitate to even sort of raise what his possible motives might be. But to draw a causal link between something he may have believed or thought or been told and the actions that he took. He was an adult, as I understand. He was 20 years old, assuming that he is the perpetrator, and therefore he is responsible for his actions, and no one else is directly responsible. Now, that being said, I think what your question gets at is this larger environment and polarization and partisanship. Is it creating an environment where, otherwise sort of well-meaning young men who, weren't necessarily interested in politics or thought to become violent, that might activate something among them? And there, I think the social science research is a little bit harder to sort of summarize and generalize. But it's definitely the case that the more you hear a particular type of rhetoric, whether that's from politicians that you support or media that you consume or your family members or people in your community or your friends, the more that you just sort of believe it, you don't question it, you don't push back against it, it just kind of becomes regular. I mean, that is what Goebbels meant by the big lie, that if Hitler just kept repeating the same thing over and over again, particularly around his anti-Semitic comments, that people would just start to believe that they're true, even if the first time they heard them, it wasn't true. And so I think that kind of wears folks down. And where people like me get really worried is that what it does is it's not just that it may inspire violence among specific individuals, although that is a problem, but what it does among the body politic more generally is allow all of us to kind of think, what would be the conditions under which we would support the erosion of democratic institutions or norms? Would it be something like the January 6th riot? Would there be conditions under which now everyday people are thinking about, well, what would happen if a candidate were assassinated? And that's a dangerous territory to be in. We want the body politic in an election period to be reinforcing democratic institutions, the rule of law and norms, and not sort of thinking, okay, well, if it were my side or if it were the other guy, would I actually be cheering? Would I be happy about this? Would this be a mobilizing force to get me to engage in behavior that I might otherwise repudiate?
So, James, as just as we wrap up, we know that Trump has officially named JD Vance, the Ohio senator, as his vice presidential pick. We've seen inflammatory language from Vance in the past against Trump, going as far to refer to him as America's Hitler. Since then, Vance has done a complete 180, changed his tune, and has become a staunch Trump supporter. Even so, how concerning is it that kind of inflammatory language is that kind of language in this country right now?
I think it depends on what the message is. And so this is where, I think the specific words matter. And there are certain words that I think are entirely appropriate in a campaign that don't, cross the boundaries, and words that might. So, for example, I think the Biden campaign truly believes that Donald Trump is an existential threat to democracy. You don't have to believe the Biden campaign. You can just look at what Trump has done in his words and what he promises to do in the future. He did incite a violent mob to try to overturn a free and fair election. And so he has promised that. And so to me, simply saying that he is an existential threat for democracy is not just empirical, but it's not even something that's generated from the Biden side. Rather, it's coming from the Trump side. That, I think, is very different than joking, even in a sly way, about an assassination of a candidate like Trump did in 2016 with respect to the Second Amendment and Hillary Clinton, or language around, using any kind of imagery or language around the use of guns or bombs or things like that. That, I think, that crosses the line. America's Hitler, I think, is very much a matter of perspective, because the reason people make that statement is not as an empirical assessment to say this person really is like Hitler, although they might be like Hitler. But the implication is probably if most of us could go back to the Weimar period in Germany before Hitler was basically installed as the chancellor in the early 1930s, and had the sort of famous thing, would you kill Hitler before he becomes powerful if you could, as an ethical question that we ponder. I think that's what that comment is sort of indicating at. And there, I think that's very much kind of a murky area between, is that what he meant, that he really should be stopped at all costs? Or is he just simply trying to say that he thinks he's a far-right extremist? I mean, I think that kind of language, it's much, much harder to tell. But it still is nonetheless worrying. And I take JD Vance at his word that when he said it, he really believed it.
Absolutely. Very worrying language indeed, especially as we approach Election Day here in the United States. James Long, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for What's America Thinking. I'm Julia Manchester. Come back next week and be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel.